Hello and welcome to The Shift, the podcast that aims to tell the no-holds-barred truth about being a woman post-40. Created and hosted by me, writer and broadcaster Sam Baker. My guest today is the best-selling author, Curtis Sittenfeld. I first came across Curtis when both of our debut novels were named Ones to Watch by Time magazine. They turned out to be right about one of us, but it wasn't me. Anyway, since that first novel, Prep, hit the big time, Curtis has written 6 more novels and 2 short story collections. The most famous of which is the transatlantic bestseller, American Wife, a fictionalised look at the life of Laura Bush, wife of George W. Bush, that ponders the question of whether she would have voted for him. Her latest novel, romantic comedy, is a total departure and absolutely the tonic we need right now. It asks, pertinently, so how come hot, accomplished women persistently marry average blokes? But it doesn't seem to work the other way around. And what would happen if it did?
It's not surprising to me that stunningly beautiful, successful women are apparently happy to date funny men. In some ways, the surprising part that's also unsurprising is that super successful men don't tend to seem to seek out funny but ordinary women.
Curtis joined me from her home in a very snowy Minneapolis to talk about how men constantly punch above their weight, why rom-coms are having a comeback, and how she found her funny. We also discussed writing out your emotions, why old is not a synonym for bad, and how weird shit has happened to almost everyone by the time they reach their 40s.
When we last saw each other, I knew I was moving to Minnesota, but I lived in St. Louis, Missouri. 5 years ago, you interviewed me in that tiny hotel room.
Yeah.
You know, being interviewed in like such a small space, I think like our knees were touching or something.
Yeah. Oh, everybody thinks it's so glamorous, don't they? But I've done interviews on ironing boards in hotel rooms. It's like, yeah, I think people think everything's a junket. Everything's all kind of glamour and...
Yeah, it's not.
So how is life? How is everything with you?
I mean, good overall. Obviously, it's been, kind of a crazy few years, but, I'm very much looking forward to my book publication. And this sounds like very self-evident, but it turns out it's fun to write a fun book. Who knew?
Yeah. It really felt like it exudes fun on every single page. So tell us a little bit about the premise of romantic comedy. And it's like literally is what it says on the tin. So it's quite a departure for you.
Okay, so I can go back as far or as short as you prefer. But when Rodham came out in the spring of 2020, which of course none of us could have anticipated that there would be a pandemic, people would say to me, well, what do you want to write, or what are you going to write for your next book? And I would say I want it to be short and fun. And then I started working on a novel in the summer of 2020, worked on it for about maybe 7 or 8 months, and realized it was neither short nor fun. And so then it's like spring 2021. And it happened that during the pandemic, my family had watched a lot of Saturday Night Live. Have you watched much Saturday Night Live?
A little bit. We don't get it here unless you stream it, but I think people know the premise, but we don't really have anything like it.
So in real life, I'm 6 years older than the character of Sally. But one thing that I have in common with Sally is she is the same age as the show The Night Owls, and I am the same age as Saturday Night Live. Saturday Night Live and I were both born in 1975. I've kind of watched it off and on almost my whole life, like since I was in grade school, when of course I didn't understand most of it, but I knew it was a little naughty and intriguing. So anyway, so I introduced my own kids to it. I think they also found it naughty and intriguing early on in the pandemic. We watched a lot, and I noticed this phenomenon, which other people have noticed, where male writers for the show and cast members who are talented, definitely talented, but, relatively ordinary looking, end up dating and in some cases marrying female celebrities, actresses or musical guests who come on the show, who are sort of, goddesses, where they're like gorgeous, super famous celebrities at the top of their game. And so it feels like there's a little bit of a status imbalance, which we can go much more into that if you want to. But I thought,
yeah.
I thought someone should write a screenplay for a romantic comedy about a female writer for a show like this, a sketch comedy show, who thinks that the reverse would never happen for a sort of talented but ordinary female writer would never have a romance with a transcendently famous, gorgeous male celebrity. And then it happens. So I had that thought. And then, probably, I'm trying to think of reconstruct the timing of this. Probably a year passed. And then I thought, the someone who should write that should be me. And it shouldn't be a screenplay, it should be a novel, basically, because I don't really know how to write a screenplay. So then I did. And it also, I actually anticipated, this makes me sound very foolish, I anticipated that this book would be 90 pages, not 300. So I thought it's definitely going to be fun. And what was I thinking?
Didn't you start out thinking Rodden was going to be super short and then write 500 or something?
I know, hope springs eternal. Because I thought it has 3 sections and each section will be 30 pages, which it does have 3 sections. I was half right. The thing that was such a great decision about writing this book was that I like doing research for fiction. And the research that I did was listening to comedians interview each other on podcasts and reading memoirs by people who've been on Saturday Night Live. So it was just this total escapist delight.
So you basically read memoirs by Tina Fey and Amy Poehler and called it work.
Well, the funny thing is, those specific people, I had already read their memoirs for pleasure years before. And I did, of course, look at them again. Because so many people who've been on Saturday Night Live are also writers and, often write their own material. There's I'm looking up at my bookshelf. Let's see. I probably read Tracy Morgan. I don't know if these names are familiar to you. Rachel Dratch, Molly Shannon, Jay Moore, Colin Jost. There's tons of memoirs. And then there's a 750-page oral history of the show. So it's little snippets from many people. And that was so fun to read and so valuable in terms of the details.
The first part, the part which is the week of an episode of Saturday Night Live, without knowing very much about Saturday Night Live, it made me feel so much. I mean, I felt like you must have been there and hung out for a week. So that, it felt so vivid.
So it's funny because Saturday Night Live is such a cultural institution in the US, a lot has been written about it. And in fact, there's a documentary made a few years ago called Saturday Night that follows the show for a week. So after I was almost finished with the book, I went to a dress rehearsal. So on Saturday night, there's a dress rehearsal with an audience, and then there's the live show. And I actually couldn't get tickets to the live show, but I got a ticket to the dress rehearsal. And I interviewed people who've worked there. So I didn't get to go backstage. I wasn't in the nooks and crannies of the studio. I was a member of the studio audience. But by that point, I had done the bulk of what's in the book. The details are based on research. They're not based on firsthand experience. Although I've taken it as a big compliment that several people have said, "Oh, did you work at Saturday Night Live?" And I think only in my dreams.
Yeah. The premise is so, the geek getting the girl, the kind of premise that you wanted to subvert. It's just it's everywhere, isn't it? It's been everywhere as long as I can remember, as long as I've been alive. It's been the stunning celebrity marries the dork and they live happily ever after. And I don't know enough about Saturday Night Live to know any examples, but that was pretty much what happened until he took too many prescription drugs and dumped her. But with Matthew Perry and Julia Roberts, wasn't it? I mean, he was just a beginning actor on Friends, and she was a guest star, and she's been on Notting Hill, and she's one of the biggest actors in the world.
It's funny because that's an interesting example. That's not most people's go-to example, but I think there are many.
Well, I don't know. Well, he's a big celebrity now, but he wasn't then.
Yeah,
I don't know. But yeah, I know what you mean. But that kind of, basically every rom-com ever is predicated on the geek getting the girl, isn't it? And it's just doesn't happen the other way. And it really doesn't happen the other way when the girl is 40.
Ha!
Or nearly.
Which I have to say, I mean, again, I thought 40's young.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
I felt conscious of kind of thinking like I have to think about the ways she's younger than I am and her cultural references that might be different.
Yeah. I mean, it's not that your earlier books were hard work in any way, but they weren't, I mean, this is really, really laugh out loud funny. And one of my favorite lines was about the case of Nancy Drew and the disappearing abortion access, which like really made me weep with laughter. Have you had that funny tucked up your sleeve the whole time?
Well, okay. So one, I feel like actually this is an interesting question to answer because obviously humor is very subjective. I think that in general, I think my books are humorous or funny for books where the primary goal is not to be humorous or funny. Like if you handed this to somebody and said, it is just hilarious, I feel like the person might start reading and be like, like sort of, like their expectations might be too high. But if you say this is essentially like a straightforward emotional novel, then I think there's lots of humor in all my books, just because I think life is very funny. Like, like life is every day when people interact with each other, it's like awkward, funny, sweet, annoying. So it's almost like if you just kind of can capture the way life really is, all of that will be in your book. But I mean, I do feel aware of myself as not professionally funny. And so I see this as a book where there's like humor is an element of it, but I know that I'm not a comedy writer. And I even think that like probably with all my books, there's something where other people think like, how did you have the nerve to do that? Like whether it's doing a modern retelling of Pride and Prejudice or like writing a book where Hillary Rodham is a character and it uses her maiden name but her real maiden name. And I think the way that I talk myself into doing it is by kind of like making my own guidelines clear to myself. And so if you had said to me, you have to write a hilarious book about working in the comedy world, I think I would have found that too intimidating. But if it's like you just have to write a novel that's about people interacting and sometimes humor bubbles up, that felt manageable to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately it does have a lot in common with your other books because it's about the kind of the double standards that are applied to women, whether it's a female politician or a politician's wife or, a comedy writer. It's still that constantly judged on your appearance and you're constantly judged on your age. And like, don't be too funny or too clever and don't make the men feel small. And even though things are meant to, and I'm sure they have changed in many arenas, that was still present when I left the corporate environment, which a while ago now, but not that long ago.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with you about that, the thread running through my various books.
What fascinates you about it?
Well, it's funny because I think in terms of the story or the plot and what happens to an individual person, which is almost always, a female protagonist. But the comedy world, has in the US certainly has tended to be somewhat imbalanced in terms of gender representation. So I think, of course, issues of gender arise. Issues of gender are certainly baked into the premise where a woman is saying, why does this phenomenon that's like very unremarkable for men, where essentially what this phenomenon of clearly dating up, why is it so unusual as to almost be invisible for women? So I write fiction to kind of grapple with issues or questions or phenomena that I think are interesting. I don't really write fiction to necessarily make a clear argument because I think I'm sometimes arguing with myself on the page. And I also will say there was this recent column, I tweeted it. The comedian Rebecca Shaw wrote for The Guardian, basically saying, I think people call her MRAT, Emily Ratajkowski.
Oh, yeah.
So it's a column by this female comedian who herself is a lesbian saying, of course, MRAT is dating this male comedian, Eric Andre, Like, why are you surprised that women like dating interesting, funny people? And I feel that way. Like, so, having thought about this, it's not surprising to me that stunningly beautiful, successful women are apparently happy to date funny men. In some ways, the surprising part that's also unsurprising is that super successful men don't tend to seem to seek out funny but ordinary women. I actually saw there was some study. I saw this also in a tweet where a study was done, and it said, I should like find out so I can kind of properly cite this, but there was a study that said both men, I think both straight men and straight women will say they really value a sense of humor in the person they date. And what women mean is a person who makes them laugh. And what men mean is a person who laughs at their jokes. And I just thought like, oh God, like that is
but it's true.
Such a bummer. I know. So depressing. And yeah, it feels anecdotally accurate.
It's like you have a line in there with Sally and another character who we won't spoiler, where she basically says that sharing a sense of humor was good enough for her, but not for him. And he's one of the guys who subsequently, punches above his weight, shall we say. And I think it's just so true. I think there's also been a bit of research on this, but it also is trotted out so often it's kind of become legend about the way women won't apply for a job unless they're 100% qualified for it. And men will apply for a job if they think they can do a little bit of it. And it's like that they're applying that same principle to relationships, like they're applying for women they're simply not qualified for, and they're getting them.
That's so true. That's really, really true. Amen.
I mean, do you think that the representation of women is getting better in fiction than it was and on screen?
Yes. I think there's a much greater diversity of storytelling. I mean, I think there are certain restrictive cultural or physical norms that are still overvalued, but I think that, even in like the romantic comedy category of book, you could very easily find books with queer protagonists of color. And I think that wasn't that common when I was growing up. So I do think it's like, heading in the right direction, that more stories are being told. And, I think there's still room for growth.
It does seem like romantic comedies are having beginning to have a bit of a resurgence, doesn't it?
I think that's true. And I think, again, I feel like I'm not like a clinician or, somebody who sort of stands outside culture and analyzes it. Like I'm kind of part of the culture, but I do think this is a moment where, not to say that all romantic comedies are, like one-dimensionally upbeat, but I think there is an appetite now for kind of upbeat stories. Or like I certainly will read very serious books, but I often won't read them before bed. And so I think there can just be like, wanting to immerse yourself in like a fun, fizzy, romantic, escapist story when the external world feels dark and stressful.
Yeah, I was just going to ask what part the pandemic played in you were deciding, I'm going to write this book. I'm going to write a book that's just fun.
Oh, it played a huge part. I do not think I would have written this book if not for the pandemic. Yeah. And I think there's also an element for a lot of people where like life can hold challenges. Like I think for a lot of people, there's sort of, things that happened during the pandemic that weren't the pandemic itself, but that were also like hard or difficult. And I definitely feel like I made a very deliberate choice. Given that I was writing this other book, and I just thought it's not sufficiently escapist for me as a writer. I definitely wrote the book that I wanted to read. And something that's interesting about this book, partly I think this had to do with rates of COVID, but I wrote this more quickly than any book that I've written, but it was during a year when I like almost completely didn't travel. It was from, sort of like summer 2021 to summer 2022 when I was not socializing very much. And I think I went on one trip during that time. And this is one of those sort of boring logistical things that I think can really influence writing. But if I go to do a book event in another city, it's often like I spend a day traveling. I then spend a day doing the event. I spend a day coming home. And then I spend a day like readjusting to being home. So I'm just kind of constantly interrupting myself. And then I also interrupt myself on the writing front where I might be like writing a novel and then I'll think like, I'm gonna just write a short story on the side and interrupt myself for a month. I don't even know why. I mean, it's not really like a logical choice. And I just felt like I lived inside the world of romantic comedy for a year. Like and I think it partly was, again, that it was like so fun to listen to comedians interviewing each other. And I mean, a lot of comedians, have had dark things happen to them or their comedy has come from pain. So it's not like it's 100% like upbeat world. Or, if you hear a comedian be interviewed, often they'll talk about their life challenges. But just like on the whole, it was such a pleasure to exist in the world of romantic comedy.
I think from a writer perspective, that's really interesting because as a writer now, you're expected to do tons of events, be kind of pretty much on call for quite a long period of time before and after your book is published, to have a social media presence and to keep that social media presence going the whole time. You obviously can't just like pop up just before the book's published and then pop off again. And those things are just like, they're not conducive to producing 100,000 words by the end of the year. They're just not.
Yeah. Because my first book was published in 2005, from the beginning of my career, I had a website. I was not always active on social media, but I always had a website. My books were always reviewed online, including by non-professional reviewers. So I think I'm probably like some of the first generation to kind of come up in an online publishing environment. And I think there are real pros and cons. Like I definitely, while writing this, was quieter on social media. But yeah, you're right. I mean, I didn't go totally silent. One thing, I'm extraordinarily lucky that writing is my full-time job. So, I can say, okay, I'm going to do writing and then maybe later in the afternoon, I'll post something on social media. And this is very hypocritical because it's like, you would not have a difficult time seeing like a post that I posted at, 9:45 in the morning. But I think I can divide the day that way so it doesn't take over my brain first thing in the morning.
In romantic comedy, there's a line where you say Sally writes out her fury. And it made me wonder, does Curtis write out her fury?
I think I write out like all of my emotions. So I don't think I'm primarily fury motivated, but there is definitely outrage in my writing. There's like confusion, there's humor, there's affection. Like I think it's all in there.
I guess it would kind of be hard not to. Do you find it possible to totally separate yourself when you're writing? To go, okay, this is take my Curtis head off, and because I personally couldn't do that.
I don't think that's my goal. And I actually, weirdly, I think the older I've gotten, the more disinclined I feel to write nonfiction. I sometimes do it, but I don't think that, for me personally, I don't think writing nonfiction about subjects close to my heart helps my fiction. I think it's almost like saving my deepest emotions for my fiction, I think does help my fiction. But it's not like, my deepest emotions come out in like a one-to-one way, or it's not as if the protagonist is a stand-in for me. Like writing fiction can give me the opportunity to sort through a lot of things. And if I sort through some of those same things in nonfiction, I think it actually robs my fiction. So I will say, like, when you're talking about like sending a tweet, it feels like no big deal. Like a sort of book promoting tweet isn't usually a big deal. But if I were to write an essay, I don't know, like if I were to write an essay that was kind of like how I arrived at my current outlook on romance and marriage, I think that makes me feel like a butterfly pinned to, a piece of paper or like a wall or something in a museum.
Yeah, kind of like cork boards, aren't they? They're almost like like a display.
It kind of feels like oversimplifying things or over-explaining things. I love reading other people's essays. I love autobiographical essays. I love memoirs. I love when people, sort of explore social issues and emotions. But for me, I think that sometimes trying to put into coherent sentences in a non-fictional way what I think about life, it feels like it's kind of maybe preempting the opportunity to like explore the rich messiness of life in fiction.
Is there a certain extent to which you can also get to hide a little bit in fiction?
I mean, I think there's like there's plausible deniability. Like, you know, I don't know. Like in some ways, something that's kind of amusing to me about fiction is even if I said to you, this is all made up, you know, none of these characters are real, none of these conversations happened. Like, I can't hide the fact that I thought that this topic was interesting enough to spend a year or two of my life on, you know, so it's almost like if somebody writes a novel that has lots of astronomy in it, obviously they consider astronomy interesting. So it's like the fact that I keep writing about sort of neurotic middle-aged women, like obviously I find neurotic middle-aged women interesting. Like I think fiction writers are often kind of hiding in plain sight.
As you've got older, how do you feel like your sensibility has changed, if at all?
I mean, this is probably a strange question, but do you mean as a writer or a person or both?
Because I suppose I would assume that your personal sensibility would affect your writing. So, for instance, where Sally is in the book is that she is coming up to 40 and she's thinking, I've been here 10 years, what next? Which I think, like pretty much any woman in the vicinity of 40, you know, give or take, late 30s through 50, is either thinking that or been through that kind of people coming up behind me who probably think that I'm not funny or clever or relevant, which kind of makes me feel like that a bit. Like, what next? What next for me, for instance?
I mean, I think that probably one of the biggest gifts of getting older is, you know, you're able to have some perspective and things don't feel like the end of the world so much. Like, I mean, I guess this is sort of a relief and a disappointment that maybe it doesn't feel like things feel less dramatic in good and bad ways. So for instance, I wouldn't think if I got some great review or some terrible review, it doesn't really make a difference. Like one review doesn't really make a difference either way. Or, you know, if there was something like some professional thing that I hoped would happen and it didn't happen, I think you just sort of ride the waves of the good stuff and the bad stuff more. At the same time, I mean, I'm very lucky and I recognize that and I appreciate it. So I signed my first contract with my American publisher 20 years ago in June 2003. Wow. And I'm still with that publisher. And so it's like to be able to write the books that I want to write and for them to find an audience, like that's a huge gift. I mean, I've certainly been nominated for a few prizes, actually more in the UK than in the US. I've never won a big prize. And I think there's probably a time when I thought, wouldn't that be lovely to win some big literary prize? And I would say I don't really care about that. And again, it's like I'm lucky, like I have some career stability. I'm supported by my publisher. So I'm not saying who cares what happens. I would never want to know my sales figures because it's only about the art. Like I am lucky in a business sense and in an artistic sense. But, you know, I think like if somebody says, oh, this book brought me so much pleasure to read, or like I stayed up 2 hours past my usual bedtime, like I think, oh my God, that's so lovely. Like that is the essential kind of great gift of being a writer, that you can kind of feel like, oh my God, I made this thing that like brought pleasure into someone else's life, especially potentially at a time when like maybe things feel dark globally or personally for people.
Something that occurred to me when I was reading it, the way the Indigo Girls keep popping up, were they like a teenage obsession of yours?
Well, so I liked them as a teenager. You know, I started listening to them in high school and college, and then I kind of stopped. And then a friend of mine, I think it was in 2016, a friend of mine asked me if I wanted to go to one of their concerts for the first time. And I went, and I did kind of think, oh my God, where have you been? Like, how was I not, you know, listening to you continuously? And I think I sort of embraced them again. So over the years, I probably listened to them sometimes, but there were some gaps, which is sort of like what my relationship is with Saturday Night Live. So I'm not quite as avid a lifelong fan of Sally. I mean, I do love the Indigo Girls, but I won't pretend that I've like listened to them, continuously for 30 years.
So have you sold the film rights?
Yes. I don't know if I'm allowed to talk about it, but yes.
Not surprised. Are you going to have a go at the screenplay?
No. I mean, if someone really wanted me to, like, I would kind of consider it. I think I've like dabbled a little bit. Like I one time, this is now almost 10 years ago, wrote a pilot for a TV show that never came into existence. And I think that I'm better at writing fiction than scripts. And it's so much less collaborative. Like I mean, this is one thing that I appreciate about getting older is that I have faith in my own instincts. And so I can say, I think this will work for this novel. And you might disagree and we might have different taste, but I have confidence in my choice. And actually, an example of that is the email section in romantic comedy. I think a lot of people would say, like, I don't want to read 50 pages of emails, including, I think, both my UK editor, my US editor, who were extremely supportive. I think they thought, well, let's see how that turns out. Like, I'm not so sure about that. And I thought, like, no, I definitely want to do this. Like, I can picture it perfectly. It's funny because a lot of people are like, some of the early reviews, like on Goodreads, which I do look at, a lot of them will say, almost like to my own surprise, I liked that part, or that was my favorite part. Yeah. And some people will say that was my least favorite part. Or some people will say, wait, COVID makes an appearance in this book, and this is supposed to be like a fun book, and COVID shouldn't be here. And I say, no, it actually should. Like, so I mean, I feel confidence in my ability to make choices for the book I write, and I'm okay with not everyone agreeing with me. But when I write a screenplay, if someone were to say the pacing is all wrong, I do not have confidence in my own expertise. So I think I'm kind of more vulnerable to being at the whims of other people's advice.
Yeah. And so a writer's room's not your like spiritual happy place then, really?
I don't think so. It's funny because there's ways in which, I've been sitting in a room by myself for so long writing that I think, oh, it would be fun to do something more social or more interactive. Like I can see the appeal, but to me, writing is a solitary activity. Like it's like you go away and then you come back and talk about it.
There's a line when you're talking about Sally realizing that she writes differently when she's seeking male approval, even when she doesn't know she's seeking male approval. And I think that kind of thinking about other people when you're writing, it's quite a thing. Do you subconsciously seek anyone's approval when you're writing or not? Are you able to separate yourself?
I think I can separate myself within reason. I think I probably do care, especially what other writers think and what people think who have expertise about the topic. So for instance, if I heard from somebody who worked on Hillary Clinton's 2016 campaign who read Rodham and said, I loved it, that's very meaningful to me. Or someone who worked in TV and says like, oh, I loved romantic comedy. Like someone reached out to me who did not work for Saturday Night Live, but did work in TV and said, I loved it. And I said, were there any TV mistakes that I made? And he said there were none that I noticed, but like I didn't work in live TV. So I think I'm kind of doing that. But apropos of the gender thing, I live in a pretty female world. Like most of the people I work with are women. The vast majority of my readers are women. It would be very plausible that I could do an event with 50 people or with like 300 people, and there would be maybe between 0 and 3 men in attendance.
Yeah, I've definitely been in those tents. You almost feel sorry for the guy because you kind of feel like at some point he's going to realize that he's the only one here, apart from the sound engineer, almost always. It's like, you must be 47 now, is that right? Yeah. How are you feeling about the whole aging, anti-aging, societal double standards thing?
So I read this book. Is this book on your radar? It's called My Last Innocent Year. And it's by a writer named, I think her name is Daisy Florin Alpert, or Daisy Alpert Florin. I'm not sure. And it's about a woman who's at a college in 1998. I think you would find it super interesting. And actually, she might be like an interesting guest for you because it's a person who's a first novelist at the age of 50. And I think in real life, this author is 2 years older than I am. And the protagonist in the book is like, she's looking back on stuff that happened 30 years ago. And especially like she had a relationship with a professor, which happened during the time Monica Lewinsky and Bill Clinton's relationship was being discussed in the media. And so she's looking back, she's seeing it through the lens of being several decades older. And so I love being able to read a book by someone who's a peer, and it has these kind of social and cultural references that are familiar to me, but it also has this gift of perspective. Like I think if you're a writer, like there's all, if you're an actress, obviously everyone's obsessed with like what your face looks like as you get older. But if you're a writer, because you're kind of leading with your mind, getting older is a gift, and like just being more interesting and having life experiences and having perspective. And I was tweeting about like liking this book and liking it for these reasons. And then a few days later, I went to a drugstore, and the man who was ringing me up says, "Do you want this?" And it's called menopause skincare. And I was thinking,
it's like number 7, yeah.
And it says it makes dull skin looks more radiant. And I thought to myself, like I started laughing when he offered it to me. I mean, something that I find kind of like to be a bummer is that I think a lot of women will reflexively say, "This makes me look old." I mean, I hear myself say this, and I actually try not to. "This makes me look old," or "I feel so old," as if old is a synonym for bad. Like it's a privilege to get older. Like it's from like a health perspective and everything else. So I thought it was humorous that this person, like, I'm supposed to be insulted that he looked at me and was like, "I'll give you this menopause." I reject the idea that getting older is like bad or shameful. It's fun. It's so fun to like be in your late 40s and have, friends in like your 40s or 50s or 60s and have like super interesting conversations with them and like super honest conversations. And weird shit has happened to everyone by the time you're 40. Yes. Like weird shit has happened and dramatic stuff that you couldn't have imagined when you were in your 20s. There's also like painful things have happened to almost everybody, but I don't feel essentially bad about getting older. I feel essentially good and lucky.
Yeah, it's so interesting you say that, because I definitely think that when you're kind of in your late 40s or 50s or beyond, and you meet someone like relatively, either someone new that you've never met before or just people that you hardly know, it feels to me like somehow that hinterland, whether or not your hinterland has anything in common with their hinterland, you're still like at a point that makes you go straight in. You know what I mean? So you almost don't have to do all the preamble.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree. It might be a couple of things. Like one, having had more life experiences that you can kind of bond over, being willing to be frank, maybe also, and candid, and sort of knowing that time is short. Like you might as well figure out if like this is a person worth knowing or not worth knowing.
Yeah, just cut to the chase. Right, I'm going to put you out of your misery and ask you the questions that I always ask.
Yeah, this has been a joy. I feel like we would be friends if we met each other in some random situation where we were not knee to knee in a hotel. I choose to think that we would be friends. I would tell you my real secrets instead of my fake interview secrets.
Right, I'm going to make that happen. Okay, what's your emotional age?
I think my emotional age and my age are the same. I'm going to say 47.
Why is that?
Well, I don't feel far older or younger, so it's sort of a default. I don't look in the mirror and feel shocked, like to not see a 20-year-old looking back at me. I think some people describe that, but I do not feel that way.
Give us a book recommendation.
A book recommendation is I just finished The Hero of This Book by Elizabeth McCracken. Is that book on your radar?
Yeah, it's just come out here. It's on my pile, but it's never yet made it to the top.
It's really delightful. It's a 170-page book. The main character is wandering around London thinking about her mother who recently died. And it's a little confusing because it's called a novel, but it feels like it's a memoir. It's like really charming. I loved it and was totally charmed by it.
What advice would you give younger women?
I think I would say find and hold on to your friends and nurture your friendships. One of life's greatest pleasures is like having old friends. I mean, making new friends too, but having old friends that you're close to and know really well.
Have you got old friends?
Yes. I'm very lucky on the friend front. And I have new friends too, actually.
Who is an older woman who inspires you?
So I have an Aunt Ellen who is 73. I've been very close to since I was about 14 or 15. And she's retired. She has some like mobility limitations. I mean, she can sort of walk around, but not super quickly or not for a great distance. She's just very funny and very open to new experiences. And, she travels and she texts. She's on this intergenerational. Do you do Wordle like on the New York Times?
I do, yeah. I hate myself, but I do it.
Oh, I love it. But anyway, she's like there's this intergenerational Wordle text chain in my extended family that so she's just like a fun, game, irreverent person. And I think that makes her a really wonderful role model.
What's your superpower?
So I think that my superpower is if I have a writer friend who's having a problem with a short story or a novel, I feel like I'm almost like a doctor who can diagnose the problem and like figure out what the treatment should be and just kind of like ask them questions that help them figure out a path forward.
That's good to know. You might regret telling me that. And how many fucks do you give?
It's funny because I've answered these before, right? Which of course I don't remember what I said. I think I would say 3. It's not 0, but it's not like 10,000.
People often answer differently, and people often change their mind just in the course of the 30 seconds they're answering the question.
What's the median?
Well, quite often people say none and then they change their mind.
Oh.
I think it's more like they feel like they want to say none, and then when they say none, they immediately think that's not true.
I mean, I think any author who admits reading her Goodreads reviews, which I've already done, clearly does not give no fucks.
How much attention do you pay to them? Do you pay much?
I reach a saturation point. Before a book comes out, I want to see which way the wind is blowing. So I'll kind of glance at things. And that's the same with reviews. Like, if it's the first day of publication and there's some major newspaper has published a review, I'll read it, whether it's negative or positive. But if it's like a month after publication and it's a newspaper I've never heard of and it's a bad review, then I would not read it.
Do you have a solid support system at home so that if something sends you into a spin, you've got some, your partner talks you off a ledge?
I mean, my husband is a very emotionally calm person. It's funny. So I think that I can go into emotional spins, but I don't necessarily go into emotional spins very often about writing or publication. Like I'm pretty thick-skinned. I mean, I've gotten plenty of bad reviews. Like I've been mocked, etc. Like I think I'm able to have perspective. So if someone were to write some scathing, mocking review, I have enough perspective to recognize like, I'm so lucky. This is my 7th novel. Like it's getting reviewed. Like having a terrible book review is like a reflection more of privilege than of bad luck, So I just I don't know. I have a healthier perspective as a writer than as a human being. Whereas like as a human being, I could have some encounter with a person and be like, they're so fucking annoying. And like, they don't see it from my perspective. What's wrong with them?
Thank you so much, Curtis.
If you need fiction diagnosis, I would consider doing it. You can let me know.
I really seriously might take you up on that.
If I do it, you might be like, oh, that's not your superpower.
Thank you for listening. You can hear a new episode of The Shift each Tuesday, wherever you get your podcasts. If you like what you hear, please do rate, review and follow, because it really does help other people find us. And if you'd like to support The Shift further, please consider becoming a member of our community. Find out more at steady.media/The Shift.